Thank you very much. So, to frame our discussion today, I was thinking a lot about the issues we all care about and about the issues of global education. I have had the privilege of coming to sessions and discussions like this. And I want to say one question that we're not debating anymore is the power of education. That education can make a difference. I just have to look in the mirror in the morning to see that. Born in a slum, displaced refugee, raised by a single mother, and education has given me the opportunities that I've had in my life. So that makes me hopeful. Hopeful that the things we all care about, we know can make a difference. But what makes me depressed is the second and inarguably more important question. Just last week, I was in Sierra Leone, in the south of the country, and I met a girl who's now 18 years old. And when she was 15, Ebola broke out. She lost her parents. She had to run away to live somewhere else. She got pregnant. And when schools reopened, the teachers told her she's not welcome in school. She was kicked out of school because she was pregnant. And now, 3 years after, she's had the baby. She's now married to another guy because the guy that impregnated her in the first place ran away as well. So that girl is the question we're trying to answer. And it's not because we all here can sit around the table and say, oh, we care about this issue. What troubles me is it's how predictable that outcome is. That a girl born in a rural area around the world today is almost certainly likely to have that kind of outcome. The bigger question is, to what extent do we care about this? When you look at the commitments we make. To achieve the SDGs, we all know that we're going to need 39 billion investments in education globally, annually. And then you look at, when we put out the call recently to fund the Syrian education crisis, only about 37% of that was funded. To what extent do we really care? And how are we showing that we care? But the most important question, in my view, is even with the limited resources we have, how are we spending that? What choices are we making? What innovation? Who are we bringing around the table? And how are we showing that we're invested and we care about what really works, not just moving by our guts, but what's the evidence for what works and how those can make a difference? Those are just the questions I was pondering. And we have the perfect panel to help us answer those questions today. So join me in welcoming to the stage our distinguished panelists. And the first person I'm going to invite is Michael Goss-Schnedlin, who is the VP Worldwide Education for Hewlett-Packard. Michael.
Thank you so much.
And next is somebody who cares about these issues a lot and thinks about them every day, the Minister of Education and Higher Education for Lebanon, Elias Bouzahab. Mr. And of course, somebody who is championing these issues I just talked about, passionate about global education, Alice Albright, Chief Executive Officer at Global Partnership for Education. Alice. Brilliant. I'm going to start with you, Alice. This is 2016. 250 million kids around the world cannot read and write. 59 million kids are out of school. How did that happen? Why?
Good question, long answer. Let me summarize. I think it's really a combination of things. First of all, I think looking back over history, there was a lot of focus on getting kids into school, but not necessarily the focus on quality. That's something that the SDG 4 is going to change relative to MDG 2. But I think that the problem goes back even before that, because that's really only a sort of a 15 or 10-year phenomenon. I think that if you look at the countries across the globe that do not have, the kids don't have access to good education, there has not been chronic investment in education dating back decades. But I think that the question we ought to be answering is, so what are we going to do about it? There are some fantastic examples of countries that have done something about it. There's a new report that was issued a couple days ago by a big new education commission that pointed to some countries that others could look to for examples. Korea is one of them. Vietnam is one of them. And over the past years, they have invested money in education. They spend a lot of time on curriculum, language, and other technical issues. They've put enough teachers in place, and they've really made an emphasis on education. They've made it a top priority for their countries. And so I do think that the place we find ourselves now is something that we can make progress on. One statistic I wanted to share with all of you is that over the coming decades, there will be 1 billion children who will not have access to the skills that they need to become productive and self-sufficient adults. So it is a problem that we must do something about. It is not a problem that's going to be solved tomorrow. But if we begin to invest resources, figure out the best way to spend that money, start really getting enough teachers on the job, trained properly, begin to work on the data issues, and take what we call, at my organization, a systemic approach to the problem as opposed to a one-off approach to the problem, I think we can begin to make a difference. The other part that's very much on people's minds right now is the issue of emergencies and crises and refugees. And of course, the minister here is dealing with that problem on a daily basis. You're doing a fantastic job. But that complex of issues presents as a whole different challenge, which is how to respond quickly in emergency situations where education often does not get looked after properly.
Thank you so much, Alice. There's so much there I'd love to follow up on, especially to come back and talk about the financing aspect, because that's something that I think the minister will also have something to say. In my opening remarks, I did talk about the challenge that you know, a girl who's born and who's affected by some form of emergency. For example, in that case, it was Ebola and other things. But in your case, you're dealing with, we know that 40 million of these kids who are out of school are in conflict-affected countries. About 2 million Syrian kids today are in danger of missing out on education. And for you, this problem is not just a stat. It's not abstract. Why don't help us frame what it means for you and how you're approaching this problem?
Thank you. You know, many years ago, I used to sit at conferences, including CGI, for the past 12 years. And I used to hear stories like the one you said about the young woman who had to deal with the situation, unfortunately. And we used to react and see how can we help? You know, what can we do collectively? How can we improve things? I never thought one day I'll be in the heart of all that. You know, when it's one thing to hear about it, and everyone sitting in the room here, I think you're hearing stories, but you're not living it. Where I come from, unfortunately, we are at the border of Syria, where the war broke, and the refugees had to flee to the neighboring countries, including my country. We are a nation of 4 million people. We had 500,000 Palestinians who flew from Palestine before, and were supposed to be there temporarily, and they're still there. And now we have 1.5 million Syrian refugees. So a country of 4 million, we have 2 million displaced people in our country. So if you want to put that into perspective, as if, what's the population here, 300 million in the US? 330. As if you had 150 million refugees walks into the United States in a year, and you have to deal with their education, healthcare, provide them with jobs, food, you name it. As Alice was saying, responding to emergencies by the international community is not at a level where they can act immediately. And this is the big challenge. This is part of the crisis. For the past 3.5 years, or 3 years, we've been waiting and attending conferences trying to see how we can raise funds to educate these children. Unfortunately, only 3 to 4% of the international aid goes to education. But we all know the answer to any problem in the world starts with education. You want to improve nutrition, you want to provide proper food, you need educated people. So you have to start with education. You want to improve the quality of life, you want technology, you want security, you name it, you need education. So while you're only spending 3% on education from the international aid, you are not attending to the problem in the proper way. For that purpose, and learning what I've learned over the past years, I was named as the Minister for Education in my country. And I was faced with, number of Syrian children that needs to go to school to get proper education. And I am a true believer that every child have the right to get quality education. In my country, in the government system schools, which is the free system, where students don't have to pay supposedly, we have 250,000 Lebanese students in the government system. I have 450,000 Syrian children wanting to go to schools. We were able to accommodate about 225,000 of them. So now for every Lebanese student, there's a Syrian student in the government system school. We started operating double shift system. So we're using the same school in the morning, and then we use the same facility in the afternoon for another group. We had to be creative. We had to think of a way to move forward. That requires a lot of funding. And Lebanon's situation, everybody knows, we never have balanced budget. Our financial situation is not very good. But we believe that something will happen, and we worked with the international community, who's always probably, a bit too late in moving. And we started witnessing these situations where we are losing a generation that is going to be uneducated. And this will not only affect Syria or Lebanon or Jordan. It's going to affect the entire region and eventually the entire world. Because, people, when they talk about how expensive education is, they have to see how expensive ignorance is. And we witnessed that. We know what ignorance did in our region. So I hope that, we will start thinking, moving forward towards the future, of having emergency funds available immediately for any situation and give education the priority in terms of, finding the proper funding to educate these children. You want to put an end to child labor. You want to put an end to early marriage. You want to put a child to recruitments for terrorism. You want to put an end to all these issues. It starts with education. If we find money to put these kids in school, we will be on the right track.
Yes, you couldn't say it better. The question oftentimes we confront in the education sector is, we talk about education and everybody knows it's important. I think the arguments you're making, Mr. Minister, are obvious, right? We take it for granted. But the real trick, as I was saying in my opening framing, is what are we really doing about this and whose responsibility it is? And that's why I want to come to you, Gus, because I talked about the 39 billion that's required annually, and the minister just mentioned the emergency funds that we need as well. I've had Mr. Gordon Brown before talk about how businesses have a duty, because right now they're not investing really in education, but they are reaping the benefits of education. Why don't you speak for us a little bit about the role of businesses, of the private sector, in helping to address these huge challenges that Alice and the minister just mentioned?
Sure, and just one brief correction. Most businesses don't invest enough into education, not all. I'd like to think that we're the exception. And for corporations, multinational corporations, small businesses, startups, et cetera, there is an imperative to make sure that the education systems are improved. When we have good education systems, we have more peaceful, just, and prosperous societies. And those are better societies from which to draw employees, better societies in which to compete. And there's this notion known as creating shared value, where HP, as a corporate actor, a rent-seeking actor who's focused on profit and shareholder value, we are incented through this program to build solutions for education that are more effective and to provide the ammunition in terms of quantitative data that prove that investments in education lead to economic and social outcomes in the future. One of the things that we're able to announce this morning with Gordon Brown, in fact, was the development of a new algorithm, an app, that shows the long-term economic and social effects of education, of investments in education today, that is now accurate enough to predict outcomes 10 and 15 years into the future. What we did was we looked inside ourselves at HP. What do we have to offer? We have technology, we have HP Labs in its 75 plus years of history. And what we decided to do was mobilize that brain power and those assets and capabilities to develop this new tool that will make the case, and it is case closed, having run many of the regression models myself. the case closed that there's no question that investments in education lead to outcomes, and it's a lot more than 3 or 4% return on investment.
Gus, I'm going to follow up with you on that. Again, I don't forgive my slight cynicism here, but I don't think the debate is whether there is a reward in investments in education. I don't think that's a question. The question is, what do you do? Like, how do you act on that? Because everybody agrees. If you do you look at, we did the global survey with the SDGs, everybody voted for education. Everybody knows, governments, you put your hands up now in the room, every room you go, what's the most important thing? People know that education is the key. But how do you move from that realization to real action, to real investment? That's the big question, I think.
Well, I hesitate to get into an argument with someone far more articulate than I am, but I would say that health outcomes are fairly easy, or much easier than education outcomes to measure, in that people have to wait a long time to get the return on investment for education. So I think having a new quantitative model that can prove using math and statistics is probably a good thing. But you have another very good question, which is, so what? What do we do about it? And I think the answer doesn't lie in spreadsheets and esoteric regression models. I think it lies into a combination of using that data to inform local and hyper-local insights, which can then bring to bear technology solutions, supply chain solutions, professional developer, professional learning solutions to those countries. And one thing that we really learned up front was that we needed to understand in a very visceral way what happens in these countries. So in Ecuador, in Peru, in Rwanda, in Oman, in Indonesia, and most recently in Hungary, we instituted something called the National Education Technology Readiness Assessment, where we didn't take the World Bank's statistics, we use them in our consideration, but we didn't take those as gospel and go and suggest solutions for the government. What we did was we went and we surveyed over 50,000 teachers and parents. We went into schools, engaged the students. We looked at the education policies, the funding policies, what sort of international aid was available. And because we had the profound insight and the access to the government because of our third-party observers like the World Economic Forum and UNESCO, we're able to provide a very neutral, unbiased opinion of how education policy reform and funding should unfold in those theaters. And we're also donating that technology to the Global Business Coalition for Education, along with that quantitative and arguably very boring but effective tool.
I'm all for boring and effective, but Alice, let me bring you into this conversation because you have to deal every day with the global shortfall in education funding. And at GPU, you have to make a decision on whose education program to fund. How do you tell us a little bit more about that model, and how do you hold both yourself and these governments to account? Because I'm really keen on the fact that we have a shortfall, we have finite resources, but how do we make these decisions, and how do we measure and hold ourselves to account in this process?
I'm glad you've asked that question because I think it gets at the heart of what you were talking about a second ago. I think that we, first of all, do need a step change around the appetite for reform. And it is some people get a little bit uncomfortable with the word reform. I'm going to say the word reform. I don't think there's any education system in the world that is perfect. And I think we've got to understand that. The how, I think, involves a number of complicated pieces. Let me just touch on a few of them. We absolutely do need more money. But no finance minister in the world, if you go to them and just say more, are going to feel very enthusiastic about that, nor any ODA donor. So we need to look at how we actually make the systems perform better. And that is, there's a lot of pieces that come in there. First of all, we've got to develop much better data so that the ministries can know what's working and what's not working. There are ways to do that. We have to measure quality. There's a real hesitation in some places to measure quality. Like it or not, PISA has had a good impact, many would argue, on at least creating some data on how different countries' education systems perform. People have different views about is it good, is it bad, but you could absolutely say that what does not get measured does not get managed. So we absolutely have to have better data. There's a lot that can be done around very difficult social issues. I come back to your friend who was not put back into school after she was pregnant. That is a very difficult social issue, but a fixable social issue. I was in Malawi about 10 days ago. The schools that I visited had mothers committees, and those mothers are in charge of finding the girls who are pregnant and getting them back to school. The education minister in Mozambique does the same thing. And so you can create shifts in days of school or ways that schools can allow girls who have been pregnant to come back to school so that you begin to break through some of the stigma associated with it. The other thing that we can work on is childhood marriage. Marrying girls very young for a variety of reasons keeps them out of school. The other thing that we can do, in addition to some of the more technical things, is really build very strong advocacy in countries to put pressure on governments and to put pressure on communities to hold themselves to account. One thing that we've done at GPE, it sounds slightly wonky, but we're very excited about it, is we've just put in place, I mean, our partnership is 65 countries plus 20 donors plus three UN agencies, multilateral development banks, teachers' unions. It's everybody in education. And we have just put in place a results framework that applies to everybody. It's very wonky. It's got 37 indicators. It's all very complicated, lots of equations involved. A number of people like me love it. But what we're going to do is use it to track how we are going to seek to bend the curve on the quality of education provision over the next 5 years. And when the numbers don't stack up, we're going to talk about it and find out what we can do to make things better. But this all requires money, it requires political will, and it requires an aha moment globally where we finally stand up and say, oh my God, we have a time bomb on our hands if we don't fix this problem now. And I think that's beginning to happen, actually. It's very exciting that people are beginning to have the aha moment.
It's belated aha moments, but welcome anyway.
Does it not work?
Thank you so much, Alice. Minister, you mentioned already that you're basically working magic in your country. You're dealing with an influx of refugees, and you've been trying very creative methods of accommodating them and giving access to education to these kids. I want us to talk a little bit more specific. So for the private sector, for donors out there, what are the key concrete things that you're looking at right now that can make a difference? You know, you mentioned that you're accommodating a good number of the kids, but from the numbers you just talked about, there are some more still that do not have access. So what opportunities are there? What are the concrete things that you're looking for right now that could help you make that difference?
Well, we created a new system that, did not exist before, which is a partnership between the government school system, the teachers that are employed by the government, and the international community, and the UN agencies, and all the donors. Every country that donated money is part of our team. We created something called the Executive Committee. Before I took over that post, they were trying to do something in that regard. It didn't work well because also there's corruption. Anytime there's international aid, there is corruption. Corruption, it starts sometimes from the ground level up. You go to a school principal and they know that they get paid per student. Then they list number of students and they say, here's the list of students that we are educating and we want to be paid, and here's the list of the teachers. UN agencies, for example, and other donors were giving an NGO on the ground the money to do that. I discovered when I took that there's another NGO getting another funding from another agency for teaching the same group. So all these things were there. I was facing them early on when I took over. And I thought we need to find a solution to that. Now, my education system in Lebanon is dated. Technology is not there. I was told that there's a program that they put together where they networked all the schools, and now They have an email address. I said, that's fantastic. I can start there. So I sent an email to all school principals. Hello, this is the new minister. Please send me a confirmation if you received that email, yes or no. And I sent it to about 1,400 schools. I received 35 to 40 replies. So basically, sometimes the donation goes to create a project, but the results of the project in that situation is a total failure. So I had to start from there, building, networking, building a strong data, because as Alice was saying, data is power. If you don't have data, you're blind. You don't know where you're heading. You don't know what you're going to be doing next. So we started working on building a data. You know, identifying the students, list them on the computers. There's no duplication. No teacher is listed in 2 different schools to get paid twice. All these things you have to worry about. Put that aside, because we want to maximize the aid that's coming in order to make the most benefits for the children and educate as much as possible, rather than having a lot of waste in that regard, to say the least. Put that aside. It's one challenge to try and take all these children and give them a classroom and put them in the classroom. But the bigger challenge is to keep them in the classroom and to maintain that from one year to another. So this is one of these issues. You put them in school, you face that they need social help, psychological help. There's a lot of violence in the schools. They come in with knives, and you know, this is a group of students who fled Syria after the war. They've seen all sorts of things before they got to where they are right now. And some of them have been out of school for 3 or 4 years, and we're trying to create programs for them. Some programs called accelerated learning programs, where we have to give them a crash course to try to accommodate them in the academic year, in the formal education system. Also, we have non-formal education. Non-formal education is good for a certain period of time. This is an argument I had to do with the international community. Everybody was so happy to go for non-formal education. I said, I will go with that only if you tell me that this crisis is going to end in a year's time. I will accept it. But if these kids are going to be here for 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 10 years, no, you need to put them in the education system. And to put them in the educational system, you have to improve your education system. You have to support it, support your schools, support your teachers. And one more important thing we need to worry about is to have the host community accept those people that came to their neighborhoods, took over their classrooms. Many things we learned. One time, one agency will come and distribute aid to the Syrian refugees. And who goes to the government system education in Lebanon? The poor people, the poor of the poorest. So they come into the classroom and they say, Syrian refugees, raise your hand. They give them books, they give them bags, they give them coats. And the equally poor Lebanese sitting there started to get irritated by that. So I called them and I said, we have to take care of the host community to succeed hosting the refugees. A lot of challenges. In the past 2 years, I can write books about what we went through. But seriously, I made a big search in the beginning, to learn from a case around the world for someone who dealt with a situation like that. It does not exist. This is probably a first. I remembered when we went with CGI, with CGIU, my friend Justin Cooper is here in the room. He's the one who got me here to start with. We went to New Orleans after the hurricane. We went to places to try and help. But you're dealing with something after the fact, after the earthquake or the hurricane hits for a day or 2 or 3 days. With us, for the past 3 years, there's a daily hurricane hitting us on regular basis, and the refugees are increasing on the regular basis. So this is a case study that does not exist anywhere in the world. However, saying all that, we have succeeded. We've succeeded to put a good, strong system in place. We've succeeded to find the necessary number of teachers to teach these kids, and we've succeeded to bring these kids into the system. The only missing part is enough financing. They challenged us in the first year, can you take 100,000 students? I said, we can. And we did it. The second year, 200,000, I took 225,000, although the funding was for 175,000. The only obstacle in our way right now to teach every child that's on the Lebanese territory is find enough funding to do so.
Thank you so much, Mr. Minister. I mean, there's so many amazing things you're doing. You're doing there, and I think I can certainly relate to the need to work with the host community. I was a refugee myself, and I went to school in a different country, and I could relate to that challenge that you're talking about. But I work now for the Population Council, and to just hear you talk about data is key. The both of you talk about the essence of data, of gathering evidence, of making sure we're guided by and led by that evidence. I think is a message that should be echoed and re-echoed, and I don't think it's echoed enough, especially because in education people believe, oh, it's important, we're doing it, but what can we do different and better? And I want to come to...
Just one second, just give you an idea to end up what I was saying. We reached a point where 95% of the students in a given school in Lebanon are refugees and 5% are Lebanese.
Oh, wow.
Some schools were running at that. So you can imagine the host communities feeling
that
when they have to get out of their school and go find another school to stay with their own community if they can.
And that's where I want to bring you in, Gus, because the minister mentioned as well technology. And I like your story about sending all these emails out. When Ebola broke out, there were a lot of good intent. It's just like as I was saying in education, it's not just guts, it's where's the evidence. Good intents, people donated tablets and iPads to places that had never even had access to the internet. And they thought, oh, yes, that's going to just make the girls get access to education. So how do you combine this good intent and the right set of innovation to be able to with data to plug some of these gaps that the minister and Alice talked about?
It's a good question. I think technology in schools and emerging markets in the early 2000s was a huge failure. I think it focused on exactly what the Millennium Development Goals focused on, access, providing access by the mass proliferation of computers, mostly in South America, but in emerging markets all over the world. Luckily, in about 2010, the Brookings Institution Center for Universal Education published a global compact on learning, which informed the SDGs from last September, where they added a really important part to access to education, that they actually learn, and it's a quality education. I think, and with our partners in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Rwanda, et cetera, we want to catalyze a third movement, the movement of outcomes. So we move from access to quality learning, now to outcomes. And one way to measure outcomes is by establishing good data practices, by acknowledging that high-stakes tests, while not perfect, are a really good indicator of cognitive skills and abilities, and by doing something that HP has adopted, which is lean innovation and rapid prototyping. One of the other announcements that we made earlier and was very graciously accepted by the minister to my left was the deployment of learning studios for 6 Syrian refugee camps in both Lebanon and Jordan. These will be sort of the state of the art. It will include 3D printers. It will include curriculum that's age appropriate and in the local language. It will include a variety of different things, but it's the same exact kit that we're deploying in Australia and Spain and Italy and the United States and Canada. There'll be a total of 66 of these. Thanks to our partners Intel and Microsoft, we're able to deploy them across 14 countries, and we will run the exact same experiments. We will run the exact same lesson plans, and they will be aligned with UNESCO standards and OECD standards, and we'll see what works and what doesn't. The same thing is true when we talk about large national deployments of education technology. When every student gets a laptop or a tablet, et cetera, I would say there are more failures than successes in the whole world. The successes were based upon a great pre-assessment, a readiness assessment. They were based upon great acknowledgement of cultural change, that they're actually humans at the end of the computers using these, and that teachers are mostly human these days. And then finally, good data systems to collect all that data and using a whole bunch of different methodologies, focus on improvement. Now that we have those data systems in place in many countries, we're actually seeing improvements, and those improvements we know are correlated to long-term returns. But I will say, the biggest lesson that we've learned as a technology industry over the past, let's say, 15 or 20 years is that a focus on outcomes not only leads to a more sort of sustainable customer, but it also creates these markets that are enormous pools of talent for us, especially in the software and services businesses. So data is absolutely important, and we must focus on outcomes, not on the mass proliferation of technology.
Wonderful. I think that's a great message as well to take out of this. Alice, I want to come to you back to the point the minister was making, and maybe to expand it a little bit, not only for what's happening in Lebanon and in Syria, but for education in emergencies in general. What innovative funding mechanisms should we be exploring? What are you working on right now to make sure that this huge gap in funding education in emergencies? I remember I was working on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa and looked at the government's programs that were put out there. The word education was barely mentioned in the response. And besides that, also, there were not a lot of evidence, as the minister was saying, out there for what really works in these settings. How do we bridge that gap?
It's a very good question. So if you look at the humanitarian, the development world tends to be divided into the humanitarian side of the ledger and what we call the development side of the ledger. The humanitarian world typically does not consider education to be a humanitarian response. Humanitarian response tends to be blankets, tents, water, food, all very important things, but that world only spends about 1% of its money on education. So when people are rushing with blankets and tents, they're not really thinking about education. So that's problem number one. The money in the development world, which is not enough either, moves very, very slowly and in a measured fashion. And so what we find in these emergency situations is that kids can go then many years without education. And we all know that the longer that a kid is out of school and the longer that the teachers aren't teaching, there's a compounding effect about how much education is really being lost. So what has now happened is we've now announced a new platform called the Education Can't Wait platform that is specifically looking at this problem. We're going to figure out both programmatically and financially how to bridge the divide between the humanitarian and the development world and begin to, yes, respond faster, but then also help countries get back on their feet faster with a view towards settling down the education system itself. So my organization, we work with about the 28 or so, 30 of the countries that we work with are fragile and conflict-affected countries. So it's about half of our business, and it represents about half of our dollars. And so when a country comes to us, as recently happened with Chad, for example, and says, we're in a crisis, we have refugees coming in, what we do is we restructure our money to them, we move it very quickly, we help either the government or whoever's there keep education going, we find additional teachers, we rebuild schools. We just restructured a grant for Yemen, actually. And we try to help countries specifically in this period of emergency and recovering from that, both programmatically and financially. But you have to be very deliberate about it and realize that conventional approaches to this aren't going to work. Let me just, if I can, touch briefly on this question of technology. And we've all seen in the schools that we've traveled a lot of computers in boxes. And we also see a lot of like physics books in boxes for, 6-year-olds. And so those are symptoms of not looking at what an education system as a whole needs. And just thinking that it's about the computer or the book or whatever the thing is. There's nothing wrong with computers and books. They're fantastic. But you have to look at how an education system functions and fix it as a systemic matter, which is what we do. And we actually tie money to the results there. So you'll have great success with it if you begin to really think about it systematically.
Yeah, it was a real epiphany, I think, that and it's not just HP, it's the whole industry. It's a real epiphany that outcomes matter and the learning part matters and that it's a whole ecosystem and that computers are great, but it's everything around them and making sure that we monitor and measure performance, but that students feel comfortable, teachers feel comfortable, et cetera. But I'm very hopeful because not only HP, but our peer companies in California, in Geneva, all over the place, I think are finally realizing that this is the case. It's not a panacea.
All right, I could let you guys go on, and we could also just go on and enjoying this. But I think we're out of time. But the session is not over yet because we're going to now move into table discussions where we get a chance as well for the respective tables around here to discuss these issues that we've been talking about and for us all to challenge ourselves and look for what CGI is about, the right partnerships to move into. But before we do that, I just want to give you all three quick opportunities to just one question for the tables for us to discuss on our tables? What question comes to mind that you want people to focus on?
Well, this is one that I've assigned to my team to figure out, so I'll use the collective expertise in the room. We know that there is a causal relationship between cognitive skills and long-term GDP growth. That was proven by the Hoover Institution and Stanford University, Rick Hanushek, one of my heroes. What are those interim measures that show that we're on a trajectory to improve learning outcomes? What interim measures are there? So that's one thing we would love to know and take away from.
Easy, guys. You can put that out.
Simple, simple.
Well, I want you to think of something. How many of you have gone through 1 year without hearing or participating at an event where problems in many countries in the world is being the discussion? So the problems are there. As long as we lived, we know they've been there, and they will continue to be there. What can we do to make the people realize that the only solution to start dealing with things like that for the future is to pay more attention and invest more in education? That's the only thing we can do right, because we're not going to be able to tackle all the questions and the problems of the world, but we can do one thing right if we all decide we can convince everyone to invest more in, and that is education.
Thank you so much, Mr. Minister. Alice, briefly, please.
I'm looking around the room and trying to get a sense of from where people come. And I think it's principally an audience that comes from North America, Europe, maybe with some exceptions. Right now, we are finding in many parts of the globe that political environments are turning inward. They're questioning the commitment to aid. They're questioning why they should care about challenges in developing countries. One profound exception was Canada, who hosted a $13 billion replenishment for the Global Fund last weekend. Good for them. That government has stood up and said, we care a lot about developing countries. But what can communities like CGI do to really turn the dialogue around so that people begin to get much more aware and enthusiastic and understand how important it is for the industrialized world to really pay attention to the challenges that we have in developing countries? How do we do kind of a game change around that?
Great. You should answer all those questions in about 20 minutes, and I'll be giving marks for that. I have one question. Obviously, it's an issue I care about, is girls and girls' education. And what can we do to invest in the evidence and to make sure that the evidence is what is leading the action and the limited investment, limited resources that we have in that. I hope that also becomes part of our conversation. Join me now in thanking our panel for doing a fantastic job. Thank you very much.